Welcome to Roll for Insight, the D&D podcast where we dive into the game, the lore, and the internet's favorite arguments. Grab your dice and your character sheet, and let's roll for insight. Hello, welcome to Roll for Insight. In this episode, we're going to be talking about the Fireball spell of the 2024 D&D Player's Handbook. So, Fireball is a level 3 evocation spell for the Sorcerer and Wizard classes. Now, this is one of the most classic mage spells in the history of D&D, and as we all know, mages are most known for saying, "I didn't ask how big the room was, I said I cast Fireball." And to prove that point, the image in the handbook shows a wizard going to town with the Fireball spell against a group of giant spiders, and the caption reads, "An elf wizard demonstrates the problem-solving potential of the spell Fireball." I love it. So, in this episode, we'll be covering the description of the spell from the Player's Handbook, we'll review some gameplay uses and examples you can bring to your table on how to use the spell, we'll get some ideas and opinions from the internet, and last, we'll end with some fun fact information about the spell. Okay, first topic, the spell details. It is a level 3 evocation spell available to the Sorcerer and Wizard. The casting time is 1 action. The range is 150 feet. The components are verbal, somatic, and material. The material component is a ball of bat guano and sulfur, and the duration is instantaneous. A bright streak flashes from you to a point you choose within range and then blossoms with a low roar into a fiery explosion. Each creature in a 20-foot radius sphere centered on that point makes a dexterity saving throw, taking 8d6 fire damage on a failed save or half as much damage on a successful one. Flammable objects in the area that aren't being worn or carried start burning. Using a higher level spell slot, the damage increases by 1d6 for each spell slot level above 3. So to clarify a few things on this spell, at its core, Fireball is a large area damage spell. And this is one of the most iconic spells in all of D&D, known for massive area damage, explosive moments, and a long history of debate about how strong it really is. Now, the area of effect is a 20-foot radius sphere, so you are looking at 8 squares across for the full diameter on the battle map, and that is huge. You're often hitting multiple enemies at once. Now, as for the dexterity saving throw, you fail your save, you take full damage, you succeed, you take half damage. So by casting Fireball, this means you're almost always doing at least something in terms of damage. Now, there's also the environmental impact to consider. The flammable objects, they automatically ignite if they're not being worn and carried, and that means that the fire can spread, it can change the battlefield, and you also have that impact of creating chaos by lighting up a zone on fire. Now, let's break down the damage real quick here. At base level, the 3rd level spell slot when it's available, this spell does 8d6 fire damage. So the average damage, the average roll, you're looking at about 28 damage per creature hit. And the fact that this can hit multiple creatures, that's what makes it so powerful too. So the minimum damage you're looking at doing is 8 damage if you're rolling all ones. Maximum damage you're looking at is 48 damage, excluding any resistance, of course. Now the scaling, doing an additional plus 1d6 per spell slot above 3rd level, so you're bumping the average damage up about 3.5 points per level spell slot above 3rd. So, Fireball does deliver a very high damage for its level, especially when hitting multiple targets. Alright, now let's get into gameplay uses here because this is where Fireball really does earn its reputation, and it's not just the damage, it's things like timing and positioning and impact on the surrounding area. So, the classic use is clearing out groups of enemies with this spell. So, Fireball is at its best when enemies are grouped up together. So as an example, your party kicks open a door, you see 6 to 8 enemies clustered in a room, and before they even spread out, you drop a Fireball into the center and instantly remove half of them from the fight. So instead of having a long, drawn-out combat, you've just turned it into a manageable encounter in 1 action, 1 spell slot. Now, Fireball is also a great way to open a fight and start combat. So let's say your party sets up an ambush, the enemies haven't acted yet. If they're standing in formation before initiative really gets going, you launch a Fireball into the middle of them. And now instead of fighting the full strength group, you're fighting a weakened one before they've even taken a turn. Now, consider a couple other things here. So you can also force the enemy into different positioning. So even if Fireball doesn't end the fight, it can change it. So let's say after getting hit by a fireball, enemies, if they were grouped up, are now going to start spreading out to avoid getting hit again and opening themselves to a repeat attack. So that can break their formation, it can reduce their effectiveness, and it can open them up to being picked off one by one now. So you've effectively controlled the battlefield without using a control spell. Now, with the environmental side of things too, Fireball isn't just hitting creatures, it affects the environment. So if you cast a fireball inside a wooden building, now parts of the structure are on fire. Now you have outside factors like smoke filling the room, and now the fight becomes a little bit more chaotic. So you might force enemies into a retreat or a reposition, or even abandon the fight entirely. It's the shock and awe aspect of Fireball that can be equally damaging to your enemies. Now you do have to be careful because Fireball is a high-risk, high-reward spell to use. It can be dangerous in confined areas. So as an example, your party's in a narrow dungeon hallway and you have enemies approaching from a direction, and let's say you drop a fireball at the edge of your range. Well, you hit multiple enemies, yes, but you're also dangerously close to hitting your own party if you misplace it. So you can have a big payoff, but it also requires careful positioning, and not all tables are going to be as lenient for placing spells like Fireball. Now, Fireball is also a great one for finishing up multiple targets, and you can clean up the weakened enemies. So as an example, let's say several enemies are low on hit points after a few rounds of combat. So instead of chasing them down individually, you can drop a Fireball and remove all of them at once. And this prevents enemies from getting that one last turn or attempting to flee. Now there's a few more considerations here. Fireball can also be used to hit targets that are behind cover, so you're indirectly targeting them, because it can still affect enemies who think that they're safe. So let's say enemies duck behind a barricade or tuck around a corner. So instead of targeting them directly, you can place the fireball behind or near them, and then the explosion still catches them in that radius. But you have to be aware that anything that can happen to your enemy can also happen to you. So they might be protected from arrows, but they're not protected from explosions. Now, Fireball is a fun spell to use, but there are times when you should not be using Fireball, or when you need to consider the risk management side of things with the friendly fire, because you have a decision to make. So let's say your frontliner is surrounded by enemies. You could hit all of them with a Fireball, your enemies, but also your ally. So do you risk damaging your teammate to end the fight faster? Sometimes the correct answer is yes. Now, some tables are going to allow that above table conversation to say, hey, can you take the hit? But other tables may not allow that, so just be aware of your surroundings and your allies and who you're targeting and who's going to be impacted by this explosion. Now, Fireball is not always the best spell to use in every single situation. Sometimes when you're fighting a single boss enemy with a high dexterity saving throw and fire resistance, well, Fireball might technically work and apply some damage, but it's not the best thing you can use with your spell slot. So this is where understanding the situation also matters. Now let's switch gears here to talk about some benefits and limitations. So the benefits of Fireball are fairly obvious. It's extremely high damage for the level that it is. It's got a large area of effect, and that makes it excellent against groups of opponents, and it's very reliable as a damage dealer, because that half damage on save means that even if they save, you're still doing something. And having Fireball scale with spell slots, this does make it one of the best damage per slot spells in the game. Now, limitations-wise, there is the risk of friendly fire, so you have to be cautious about using it. And fire resistance and immunity is a common feature for a lot of enemies. It's a very common element to be resistant to. Now, it is less effective against single targets and characters with high dexterity because they will likely make those saving throws. And you have to keep watch for the unintended consequences of fire and collateral damage here. Now, let's switch over to some internet discussions and opinions here. One of the biggest debates in D&D is calculating the damage that Fireball does. So many players believe that Fireball is intentionally stronger than other spells. And it is actually true. Designers have stated that Fireball is supposed to feel powerful. And because of the high damage, it's often the standard for comparing damage to other spells. So if a spell does less damage than Fireball, then players often question the value of it. But keep in mind, yes, it does a lot of damage, and more so than most spells, but the fire resistance keeps it balanced. A counterpoint that a lot of people point out is that there are a lot of enemies that are resistant or immune to fire, and that helps Fireball from being too dominant in every single situation. But in general, Fireball is a very well-received spell. It is peak D&D fantasy. People love throwing fireballs into rooms. It's impactful. It creates the big moments that a lot of people like playing for, and it really does deliver on the whole wizard blowing up the battlefield feeling. Now, to wrap things up for this episode, the fun fact information about the Fireball spell. The material components for Fireball are bat guano and sulfur, and this is actually rooted in real-world history. Now, bat guano, or bat poop, was historically used to produce saltpeter, or potassium nitrate, and that is a key ingredient in gunpowder. So gunpowder composition typically includes things like saltpeter, sulfur, charcoal, and having Fireball's components directly mirror that real-world explosive materials means that Fireball is a fantasy version of a controlled explosion that also sometimes has uncontrolled results. Well, that's it for this session of Roll for Insight. Thanks for listening, and thank you to all our supporters on patreon.com/rollforinsightpodcast. And we will see you next time.